So this kind of really sparked my interest, and I decided to research the history of Phillips Park Cemetery and find out exactly just a bit more about it, how it came about, how Manchester really got its first municipal cemetery. But in order to understand how Manchester got its first municipal cemetery in 1866, we need to go back a bit further and think about what was happening at the beginning of the 19th century. So if you died at the beginning of the 19th century, the chances are you would have been buried in your local parish churchyard, wherever that may be. But what was really interesting for me is to see, okay, how did we go from churchyards, little graveyards, into these big, beautiful, what we call garden cemeteries? And I was really fascinated by that. And we really, in Manchester, it's really clear actually how that change happened, and it's a great city to focus on if you are interested in death in the way I am. So Manchester got its first, what we think of as a cemetery, in the 1820s, and that's Rusholme Road Cemetery. Now I have, if this works, I'm going to try and share my screen. Bear with me 1 second. Hoping this will go well. Right, okay. Right, can you see that map? Just put a thumbs up. Yeah, brilliant, thanks, Karen. So this is Rusholme Road Cemetery. Sadly, it's no longer there. It's actually, I think it forms part of our campus. But this was what we would think of as Manchester's first cemetery. It was set up by a group of Unitarians. They were dissenters. They wanted their own place to bury the dead, and they set up Rusholme Road Cemetery. They set it up as a joint stock model, so people would basically buy kind of shares, and the more burials, the more popular it was, the more it would go up, and then people would receive the dividends. And it was a profitable business. The Victorians were not behind the door when it came to coming up with these joint stock ventures, and this cemetery was one of them, and it proved really popular. Now it was a beautiful cemetery by all accounts. I haven't seen any photographs of the cemetery when it was in operation, when it was opened in the 1820s. I've seen a really bad rundown picture of it from a Manchester Evening News article, I think from, I don't know, I think it was about the 1950s, and you can't really see much of it at all. Obviously it's no longer there anymore, it's gone, but that was Manchester's, what we would think of as Manchester's first sort of garden cemetery. Now this joint stock model proved really popular, and in the 1830s Manchester got 2 more joint stock cemeteries. Got this beautiful cemetery here, which is no longer there. This is Ardwick Cemetery. This now forms part of John Dalton's buried in here, but it actually forms part of near Manchester's Gay Village, not far from there. Obviously it's no longer there anymore, but that's Ardwick Cemetery. The other cemetery, which is still there, it's now run by, oh, hang on a second, bear with me a second. Can you all see that? Yeah, Karen, can you see that? Yeah, fabulous. Okay, this is on the Queen's Road. This is Manchester General Cemetery, and this was another joint stock cemetery. And really these cemeteries opened more or less on the back of how well Rusholme had done. So it had proved so profitable that these two both opened. And there was a lot of competition, by the way. So the proprietors of this cemetery tried to stop the Ardwick Cemetery being built, because they kind of thought that these would take away burials and it would affect their shares. They did try and stop this cemetery, trying to stop Ardwick being built, but it was built. This cemetery is still there. Unfortunately, these beautiful buildings are no longer there. they have been demolished, but the cemetery itself is still there on the old Queen's Road. So I'm just going to give you, I've just got a couple of maps I'm just going to show you. So if we think about 1820, this was kind of, these were all the burial places that were in Manchester. So if you died in 1820, you could be buried in one of these burial places. So we have, it's colour coordinated in terms of religion. So we've got red is for Roman Catholics. Sorry, totally lie. My green is for Roman Catholics. My orange is for non-conformist dissenters, and the red is for Church of England. So you kind of get some idea there. I just want you to focus on that map, and then if I show you by 1850, you'll see how many new burial sites have arrived. So throughout the 19th century, we see that burial places within Manchester both develop and also decline. And the reason for their development is obviously because new communities grew, the population's growing really fast, and we see these new places develop. You'll also notice that some of them are no longer there by 1850, and that's mostly because they are full and they have been closed, or development is happening in Manchester all the time. So, for example, railways are coming through, new buildings are being built, and this meant that some of these burial grounds disappeared. So I was interested to look at in my PhD why this happened, why burial sites developed, and why they declined. And I was also interested to look at why people chose to be buried in particular graves. Why did, for example, somebody want to be in a family plot with their family, or why were some people buried in what we call common graves? And I suppose the misconception has always been that if you're buried in a common grave, you must have been a pauper. In other words, that your burial was paid for by the state. And work that I've been doing has found that's actually not the case. So I've been looking at thousands of burial receipts for people who were buried in what we call common graves, and I found that most of them, the vast majority of them, were paid for by the family. So the family made the decision that they were going to pay for a burial, and they were going to bury their relative in what we call a common grave. Now, the reason why you wouldn't have wanted to have been buried a pauper in the Victorian times is because it carried massive stigma. So if you were buried a pauper, it would be, quote, according to a historian that I use a lot called Lecoeur, it would have been a massive stamp of failure. In a class-conscious 19th century, if you are buried a pauper, you have failed in life. And that would have sort of broader connotations for your family that are still alive. They would have to face the fact that, they would have to deal with the fact that you were buried a pauper. So millions of people saved in savings clubs. It wasn't because they were afraid of being buried with paupers in common graves. We know that because I've looked at thousands of burial registers that tell you how people paid for their graves. But it was the fact that they wanted their own trappings. They wanted their own say on how they were going to be buried. And because of that, they wanted to pay for, have some control over that burial process. So again, people often think that the most popular grave in the 19th century was what we call the family grave, the private grave. We've all seen them with the headstones. There's 4 members of the same family in, and that's not true. The most popular grave in the 19th century was the public grave, the common grave, especially in the Northwest. So, so that's just me sort of, I'm very conscious of time. That's just me just speaking a bit about sort of the different places you could be buried in Manchester, and the most popular types of grave that people were buried in. I could talk to you all day long about body snatchers and things that the Victorians were really worried about when it came to burying the dead. They wanted to make sure that their graves were safe, they were secure. Body snatchers, especially in Manchester in the 1820s, were a real concern. But I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to pass it over to Sam because I'm conscious that I've just used up my 10 minutes. and I don't want us to overrun. So I don't know if Sam would like to take it away.
Thanks, Michala. Hi, today I'm going to be talking about practices with bodies and cremation ashes, and I'm going to be bringing it right up to practices that we engage with today. This, you might find it difficult, especially with our lives being so touched by the pandemic at the moment. If this is the case, please just look after yourself in whatever way works for you. I'm going to share with you how death practices that relate to the final resting place of the body are influenced and shaped by what's going on in wider society, which obviously Michala's touched on there as well. I'm going to be talking in quite broad brushstrokes, so we are moving through time, so we will be losing a bit of the nuances, but we'll be looking how society relates to the self and how that affects what we do with a dead body. So I'm going to be sharing with you how we're moving towards more multiple and personalised practices. It's not to reflect all the different practices that take place in the UK today, and your family may engage in practices that we're not covering. Certainly, as the UK has become more diverse, there's more practices that are maintained within the UK that are not reflected within this broader model. I'm going to share my screen with you now. And are we there? Can you see that, Karen? So when we're thinking about how we move through time, I think about it as from rest in peace to I did it my way, or we did it our way, as we might go on to explore. So we're going to start off with traditional death, and this was just the dominant form for many centuries. And I think about it as rest in peace because it was primarily concerned with the fate of the soul. This lovely picture here I took in Wales at St Ishmael's down in Pembrokeshire, and I thought it really encapsulated this idea that we sort of carry around with ourselves of resting in the beautiful, beautiful graveyard. It represents what happened to our bodies before industrialization and the growth of cities. So before that time that Michala's talking about there. Death happened in communities, and it was for me frequently quite a communal experience. The deathbed was often a hive of activity, and there was no notion of your death being a private affair. Indeed, the notion of privacy hadn't really been associated with death at all. Death was quick and it was frequent. So there was a limited understanding of medicine. Death became known as the will of God, something beyond our control. Your funeral director for this period of time is likely to have been your local carpenter, and they're going to be mainly concerned with making your coffin. Sometimes they transported the body, but often that was family and friends transported the body. You died at home and your family and friends moved you to the church. People lived in communities with really strong ties, and the fate of the body was really connected not only to the community's faith, but also to maintaining the authority of the church. Bodies were buried in consecrated ground close to the church itself. The church was the hub of the community and also the protector of the dead. And then we move into the period that we'd recognise more sort of started in the Victorian era, when modernity really started to kick in. And these pictures here, that's taken at Blakely Crematorium, which if you're into modernist crematoria, which I am, Blakely's an absolutely fantastic example of that style of architecture. During this time, the focus really shifted away from God, and it started going towards creating a lasting memorial. I think of it as in memory of, and it's in memory of the person who has died, and a lot of the materiality is based around constructing that memory. The treatment of the body represents the shift towards a more modern idea of death. As say, it began in the Victorian era, but it sort of continued throughout the 20th century and really was still developing in the 1950s. During this period of time, funeral directors go through a big process of professionalization. They start to become more of what we'd recognize today. And a really important key factor in how we related to death at that time and how that impacted on the body was that we started to die in hospitals in really massive numbers. This really came into sharp focus after the NHS was established and people moved into hospitals, and that's where they had their final moments. Therefore, something was needed to therefore take the bodies from the hospitals and make sure that they were transported. Also, it became really prevalent this time to be buried in cemeteries outside of the town for reasons of hygiene. Death became really something that was sort of tied away, if you like. It was put into hospitals and it was put into cemeteries on the outskirts of towns. It's at this time that many academics argue that death became taboo, started to become taboo in the West in particular, that it became separated from the communities where it used to take place and that it became highly medicalized. Death became a private affair, no longer a communal experience, but something that was to be experienced within your immediate family only. We see the rise at this time of the secular professional. So doctors become the authority over the dying, and then funeral directors really become the professionals who govern the dead body. When it comes to the body, we really, at this time, we do what funeral directors tell us to do, and they tell us what's the right and wrong thing to do in these circumstances, and we kind of follow their instruction. In the pictures here, we can see the name plaques in the memorial wall. Although the rich and the powerful, as always, had opportunities to express their status and their uniqueness, what we find in this time is that for most people, certainly in the 50s, there's a move towards uniformity in memorial options. And we see here people can have their names and they can have a flower, but there's little personalization beyond that. The fate of the body at this time was to rest in the cemetery, in landscapes dedicated to the memory of the dead. Even when the body was cremated, for the majority of the 20th century, those cremation ashes were then interned, scattered, or stored in cemeteries. And then we start to move towards some more personalised practices that I really think of as I did it my way. We gradually see this emergence of these practices throughout the latter half of the 20th century, as they're very uncommon in the 70s, and they really start to grow from this time. Although the first crematoria opened in 1885, cremation rates were really low until after the Second World War. They started to steadily grow from that point. Around the late 60s, they became the primary form of disposal of bodies. Now, around 77% of all deaths in the UK result in a cremation. And clearly, it's this move towards cremation that's enabled these more personalised practices to emerge. Cremation creates, if you like, stability in the body. It changes the body in such a way that it can be handled by people without the hygiene concerns. And also, it can be handled outside of that professional relationship of the funeral director. But what really started the change wasn't the move towards the cremation. It was this when people started collecting their cremation ashes from funeral directors to engage in their own ritual practice. And there was quite a delay this starting. Although we had the cremation increasing throughout the 20th century, people really didn't start to collect cremation ashes until 80s, 90s. It was virtually unheard of in the 70s. And certainly now, it's hard to tell because the data is really patchy, but we estimate well over it. In 2005, a survey was done, and at that point, 60% of people collected ashes to engage in their own practices. We presume that it's more now. At first, people were keeping ashes at home in traditional urns, so they were sort of mimicking what happened in the graveyard, and they were just sort of taking that into their own homes. But now, a lot of people are collecting ashes to engage in their own rituals, scattering cremation ashes in locations of meaning to the deceased and their family. In these practices, the authority of making a decision about what is right and wrong is the deceased and the family. The practice is the right thing to do because the family have chosen it. We see the dead breaking out of the traditional landscapes and appearing on our parks and in our mountains, scattered in locations of personal meaning, but often locations that are shared with the living. We have a picture here of ashes being scattered in the countryside, but we also have a really personal memorial in the park. This memorial was in a space that I regularly visit, and it was updated for years with flowers, different gifts. We can see here that this was something that around Christmas time, it was changed again, and we see some Christmas gifts here. It's not in a formal space set aside for memorials. It's on a tree, close to a path, completely unregulated by any professionals in the way that a cemetery is. It's not clear if this memorial had ashes scattered, but it's really common for this to be the case. As ashes are scattered at memorial benches and other public locations, flowers, cards and gifts are increasingly left, and they become a sight as we negotiate around our own parks and public spaces. We've also seen a change in cemeteries as rules are slightly relaxed about what can be left around graves. Personhood is at the front of these practices, and by that I mean what uniquely makes you you. It's you and your loved one who are the authority who decide how your body should be dealt with after death. However, it's not really the individual self. I guess it's more we did it our way than I did it my way, because a lot of these practices are about our connections to others. And really a practice that shows this well is ashes creations, when ashes are combined into objects or put into tattoos. The very nature of ashes means that they can be divided up, and therefore you can engage in a number of practice with the same cremated remains. The pictures here are of someone's parents' ashes in a necklace, and also cremation ashes that have been incorporated into two tattoos of two very, very close friends. It's actually the husband of one of the ladies, and they both had a tattoo with his cremated remains. In these practices, distance is reduced. You no longer have to visit the grave. You can wear your loved one on your body or have them inside your body. These practices are about continuing bonds. And in that way, they're nothing new. We can see certainly in Victorian mourning jewellery, for example, the continuation of bonds between the living and the dead. These people all scattered ashes in other locations. They said that the practice of the jewellery or the tattoo was for them, but the scattering was for their loved ones. Today, the fate of the body is more likely to be multiple practices decided on by the deceased and their loved ones. And these practices are more likely to happen in locations that we share with the living. This is reflective of a wider shift towards the importance of personalised experience in how we understand the world. We can see shifts in society come to be reflected in how we memorialise. It's not really that we move from one to the other. It's more that we live in a time when they can all exist at once without necessarily contradicting each other. The right thing to do becomes a highly personalised choice. I think as we reflect on the losses of COVID, especially how this has impacted on our ability to say goodbye at funerals, I think that how we memorialise the dead will continue to evolve. And I think I'm done my 10 minutes. I hope I've not gone over there for you, Karen. Karen, you're on mute.
I'm coming back. Sorry, that was very, very interesting. So I know that you and Michala have got some questions that you're just going to discuss, and then we are getting some in the chat as well. So great, thank you so much both for that. And Michala, I'm going to pin you as well. So you're both pinned. And I know you're just going to have a little discussion now to, to carry us forward to the next stage of the session.
Oh, Michala, I'm dying to know a little bit more about body snatching in Manchester.
Oh God, how long have we got?
Oh, not too long.
Yeah, so Manchester and the place where you had anatomy schools obviously bodies could reach an all-time high. And in Manchester in the 1820s, we had 2 anatomy schools that opened. So bodies could fetch as much as £10, which obviously is a fortune in those days. So yeah, there were no end of body snatchers. And if you look in places like, Manchester newspapers, which I seem to live in old newspapers at the minute, you will see pictures of graves with all railings around, so safety is a priority. When a new burial ground opens, the first thing they say is, high walls, safe from intruders, that sort of thing. It's all around the safety. Thankfully, come the 1830s, and anatomists had more access to body snatching does, pardon the pun, does die off. But yeah, in the 1820s, it was big business, and people would even travel up from London to come and stay in Manchester to steal a few bodies that had literally just been buried, and then pop them in beer barrels, and then send them off to places where they had anatomy schools.
So they were more available in Manchester. You were able to get your hands on a body more readily in this city, are we saying?
Yeah, quite. But I mean, we didn't have the worst mortality rates. Worst mortality rates were obviously London and Liverpool, but we weren't far behind. So yeah, enough. I suppose enough people where somebody's body could go missing and somebody wouldn't really notice. They'd be very clever to fill out the grave and put the mound back, so you would assume that that your relative is still in the plot. Yeah. So, and I've got a question for you as well, especially in terms of cremation and cremation art. I mean, I've got friends and family members who have actually used ashes and put them in like necklaces and rings. So do you think that's now a growing business in itself? Because I always think, like, I don't know if I'd want to be cremated. I don't know if it's because like I'm still in the Victorian times and I'd like to be buried. But I'm just fascinated by having that you can wear something that was your, I mean, this is a bit sad, but when my horse died, I actually kept a lock of his tail, and excuse me, and they turned that for me into like a bracelet. Yeah, they turned the hair into a bracelet, and I don't wear it, it's quite fragile, so I don't wear it a lot, but that meant a lot to me because when my horse died, very close to him, and that meant something for me. But do you think it's a growing business?
No, there's a lot of my PhD involved not only researching with people who commissioned these objects and lived with them, but also artists and other people that cremated them. So I did a lot of work around the businesses. They're all small businesses. They're all small, often family-based businesses or sole traders who are artists in whatever form it is first. So the guy making the raku was a fantastic raku painter, potter, the person doing the glass. So they tend to be craftspeople who are experts in that particular area. So these are small businesses. I don't think it's going to grow much more than it is. It's been around for about 25 years. And I think it will always remain, I wouldn't say niche, because it's popular enough to sustain a national network of these small businesses, some of which are doing really well. So, it's never going to be, it's never going to be a Google, for lack of a better word. It's never going to be huge. It's never going to be like the Co-op funeral. It's always going to be, I think, quite small, because just because of tastes of what people feel is appropriate. You have to really like that jewelry or really like that tattoo. So personal taste comes into it quite a lot. I think the growth is going to be online. Right. Okay. I think that we're going to see a revolution in how we relate to the dead. And I think that's going to be online. And I don't know what that means for me with my fascination with bodies and ashes. But
Yeah.
I think that's what's, you know, is going to happen and where we're going to see the growth. We certainly see that if somebody's taken from us quite quickly, their Facebook can be maintained for years and they continue to have that online presence. And we see a myriad of different organizations offering some sort of digital memorial. But I see that being potentially the area that there's going to be some kind of huge shift. Whereas the other stuff, I think, will just bubble alongside. Like I did, one of the people that I researched with had vinyl records made of their mother's voice. And I think that's only going to ever appeal to, you know, a certain amount of the population.
Well, I don't.
And the record contained her ashes as well.
This is going a bit slightly off, but one of the genealogical engines now, one of the big, you know, the big sites, they've actually made black and, you know, your old images come to life. It's very strange. So if you've got an old image of, like, you know, for example, my granddad, no longer with us, they've actually used some sort of computer technology where he moves and he comes to life. I know, a bit odd. Anyway, I'm just going to hit some questions because there's quite a few questions in my chat box. So, hi Judith. Judith said, what do the blue grounds indicate? So they indicate parish burial grounds. Pat's got a question. What happened to the graves in closed cemeteries? Most of them stayed there. So, for example, All Saints, which is right at the heart of my campus at MMU, the graves are still there. It just got grassed over and then turned into a park for kids. And now it's a park where our students go and relax, and we like to think that they study there. So most of the time it's that expensive they wouldn't have removed, excavated all the graves just because of how expensive it was. Were common graves always used at once as strangers who had died, or were some of them still graves with only one family? No, so it would have been basically they would open up the grave. They'd normally have about maybe 2 or 3 common graves open at the same time, and they would just literally sort of, as you died, whoever it was, it would be, you know, one on, then another, then another, then another, then another. Sometimes you do get members of the same family in one common grave, but that's only if they died of close together. So if a disease had swept through the house and they were, for example, interred on the same day, that you may find that you've got 2 family members in a common grave.
Can I do from, sorry.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it, Sam.
Harriet here, talking about a sister in Germany, says that relatives have to keep a subscription to the local cemetery or the body may be removed. She couldn't tell me what happened to bodies that were no longer paid for. So originally when you bought a grave, it was for keeps, it was in perpetuity, and you kept that grave and your family kept that grave, but that's no longer the case across the UK. So it's not just Germany. You rent graves in the majority of cemeteries now for a period of time, and then their fate is to go to that sort of more communal grave option if the payment's not maintained. They tend to be for like 20-30 years. It's considered to be a generation. So the idea is when that grave will come up to be renewed, some people may want to continue it, but some people don't. It's just it's definitely a land use issue. And it's because they cannot possibly give everybody a grave for keeps going forward, considering the size of the UK.
Yeah, I will say that in the Victorian times it was 100 years. So, for example, I can't name the celebrity, but I've been working on a show and we didn't actually do this story, and it was a brilliant story of one of the celebrities that I've been working with. His grandmother actually came to, sorry, let me rephrase that. His great-grandmother came to bury somebody in what they thought they owned a burial plot, and there was somebody already in it, and from somebody totally different. So Phillips Park Cemetery and some of the municipal cemeteries, you've got 100 years basically, and then by that point it's thought that, you know, the person would have decomposed. It's long enough that then that spot will be reused. When I spoke to the Manchester Bereavement Office about 10 years ago, he thought we had about 30 years left of burial space before we would be full. So there is that idea of reusage. There's also in some cemeteries in Manchester, I know they're doing it in Phillips Park, what used to be pathways are now being turned into burial plots. But don't forget, there's not just like your usual normal cemeteries. A lot of people now are having what we call woodland burials, which means that, you know, there's no marker to say you are there. You're in a wicker coffin, and you are in, you know, having a woodland burial. I'm just trying to work down the list to make sure that we're not missing any.
Also, I guess as well, if we've got 77% of people are cremated, and of that 60% are collecting their ashes and scattering, in fact, the deceased are all around us. The primary form of burial now, I guess, is in our parks and on our mountains, and you know, in our sort of shared living spaces. So we don't think about that so much, but actually that's the majority form now. Going inside a grave for 30 years is becoming rarer. Can I pick up on this one around organ donation here from Zoe, about whether organ donation has an impact on how people are then cremated or buried, or donating bodies to medical science? If the body's medical science, I do believe it's a cremation, but certainly organ donation takes place really soon after someone's medically passed. So cremation takes place, or burial, much further along the process. If we think of dying as a process, it happens much further along. So no, there's no real impact. But if it's medical science, as far as I'm aware, I think that tends to be a cremation, which they pay for and then return the ashes to the family.
I'm trying to think. Judy says that there was an observation tower built in one cemetery for the relative discreet 24-hour visual after funerals until the body had been decayed beyond usefulness for the body snatchers. That's true, because as much as we like to think, you know, and we don't get me wrong, the Victorians did care about people buried who were buried in their burial grounds, but they also, some of them really cared about making a profit. So if it was, you know, the Quaker burial ground was always targeted in Manchester, but if there was that concern that the burial ground wasn't, people would go somewhere else, and there were enough burial places in Manchester where you could go somewhere else. So it was in their sort of vested interest to make sure that the grounds were safe and they were protected. I think you've got one here. Is it from Liz? Does anyone else think that wearing ashes as stones will become as popular as it was to use memorial jewelry containing lots of hair or teeth? Yes, I've seen so many of those.
It may become as popular, yeah, but you know, those businesses have been around now for quite a while. They've been around for a few decades, so I think it'll just become, I think we're just going to see more and more fragmenting of options. So some people will go for the jewelry, some people will go for tattoos, and you know, we'll see it fragmenting more and more.
I think I can pick up on a couple here. So, are there documents kept in Manchester as to who is buried in disused cemeteries? Yes, they are. So Manchester's burial records are split, if you want to have a look at them online, between Find My Past and Ancestry. So if you're looking for parish records, you want to be on Ancestry. If you're looking for cemetery records, you want to be on Find My Past. They do have, Find My Past definitely have Rusholme, and they definitely have Ardwick Cemetery. Manchester do have their own cemetery search engine. I think it's called Manchester Burial Records. If you type it in Google, it'll come up. But they do charge, unless you go to Central Library once we're all out of this daft lockdown. Once Corona's gone, go to the library and you should be able to have a look at that for free. So yes, all the records, most of the records are online. When did local authorities in the area begin providing cemeteries? Manchester got its first municipal cemetery in 1866. Salford was before this. Manchester went for some 20 odd years without a municipal cemetery. The parish burial ground was full, it had closed. Manchester Corporation were really slow at getting a municipal cemetery. They were reliant on the joint stock cemeteries that I told you about before. One of those, Manchester General on Queen's Road, they were burying most of their paupers in that cemetery. So they didn't feel that they were in any rush. Salford had Weast, but yeah, we were quite late. Do you want to take a couple, Sam?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Charlotte for sharing that wonderful story with us, saying after my, can I just take a moment to read it out if that's okay, Charlotte? After my husband died, we scattered his ashes between our home and the M6 in the garden to keep the M6 from further encroaching on our home. Done by his prior suggestion and agreement. Years before, my mother was scattered near her house where we had buried her parrot. It's about our right to our own history and memory. Thank you, Charlotte. I think there's really, it's got an edge of humour in it to stop the M6 continuing to encroach on your home. And I think that's right. We're able to now create narratives that are not as concerned with status as, say, the Victorian period, where we're able to create rituals and practices that are of real meaning to our immediate family. And I think cremation, that's been an unexpected effect of it, really. You know, it was brought in, this whole idea of modernity and progress, and you know, it's hygienic, but actually what it's allowed us to do is to sort of take control of our own memorialization narratives. And yours really put a smile on my face, and I can't thank you enough for sharing that.
I'm just going to pick up on another one here. So I haven't visited the catacombs in Paris. Believe it or not, Anfield Cemetery in Liverpool, which is a municipal cemetery, actually has catacombs. So yeah, so there are some close-ish if you go to Liverpool, but I haven't been to the one in Paris. So yes, so there were there Jewish cemeteries in Manchester and Salford? Yes, they were Jewish cemeteries in Manchester and Salford, and I have done quite a bit of work on too. Manchester got 3 Jewish burial grounds in the 19th century. And what's really interesting about their burial grounds is they actually have one dedicated to poor children, which is quite unusual at this time that they would have a burial ground just dedicated to poor children. Prior to the 19th century, the nearest burial ground was in Liverpool. But yes, we do get 3 Jewish burial grounds in Manchester, and then they also get a section in the municipal cemetery, just slightly later. I don't know if you want to pick up on.
I want to Susan for sharing as well. And one beautiful story, lady who had her father's ashes painted fingernails, so in the aisle. I think that's lovely, and it reminds me of participated in my PhD who'd had his father's ashes in a raku teapot. And at first there was, people were sort of dismissive of this, like it was a novelty, but actually it was a beautiful thing. He lived with his father, and every day when they'd collected his children, the boys from school, they used to sit down together and share a cup of tea, and that was their sort of daily ritual, because his father looked after his children. And so by putting that way into this raku teapot, this ritual, this family ritual, was able to continue with his dad as present. And your story really reminded me of that. It reminds me of we're creating, rituals that are about confirming those immediate relationships. Like I say, it's not I did it my way, it's kind of our way. And I think it's a great example of that. Like the dead are carrying on in lives, and not in a natural, people don't think that they're ghosts and they don't treat them as such, but by doing that, she's putting her dad not in a past memory, she's actually putting her dad in the present, almost like a living part self. And certainly that other people who report them is a active rather than a previous memory. So thank you.
This is a question actually that I'd like to scatter like.
Oh, well, that's interesting. So the UK has got one of the most permissive ashes scattering cultures in the world, actually, well, the Western world. Has a lot more stricter regulations than we do. I think France doesn't, but this isn't common in France because of the history, sort of more Catholicism there. So the UK, in to the extent that we scatter ashes, we're supposed to the permission of the landowner. The only thing that there's strict regulation about is scattering in watercourses, because obviously there's an issue if you see where that's then used into drinking water. So that's the only regulation there is. On land, you're supposed to ask the landowner permission, but unless the landowner at land sealed off, example, they can regulate it, but on just kind of usually not asking, just getting on with it in their own rituals. This create, number one, there's some people who really don't like this. They're really upset by it. It makes them quite upset, and they don't. But two as well, there tends to be some environmental issues, because no matter how individual we are, we actually all tend to scatter in the same place. And when you think, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of bodily remains each year being scattered on the top of Snowdon, being scattered on the top of Ben Nevis. So it tends to be an issue when the entire ashes are left, because it's between about 4 and 6 pounds. So that's quite a lot. So the answer is, there is very little regulation, there's guidance. You're supposed to get the landowner's permission, but most people don't. But then that does create tensions. It creates tensions for the people who own the land, but it also creates tensions for people who use the land as well. So it's not a practice that's not sort of contested by others.
So if I wanted to be scattered at Old Trafford on the pitch, I'd probably have to get permission, would I?
You have to get permission, unless you're going to, like, just, you know, run across the pitch at half time and then just scatter as you go. But most of the football grounds have a place now, because the ashes are not any good for the pitch, so they have a location where you can go and do that. They've accepted and embraced the practice, in part to stop people doing it illegally and end up impacting on the quality of the pitch. So the good places, like good well-managed parks, good well-managed football grounds, they know people want to do this and they create a space to do it. Whereas other places, you know, people, even when that happens, people are still scattering their own ceremonies. And as I say, it only really causes a problem when people leave the whole 4 to 6 pounds, which is actually, it's quite a lot, you know, it's quite a lot of material really, and it can over time impact on the environment in that location.
My mum wants to be scattered in America on the Hollywood Hills. Can you imagine that? Well, first she said she wanted to be buried there, so we can't afford that. I said the best I can do is cremate you, stick you in my handbag, and try and get you across.
You can get permission you can get permission quite easily. You know, you can. You're best to do that rather than trying to explain the strange material in your bag.
I said, I think it's that time we have the conversation. I said, what do you want to happen to you when you die? She said, well, I'd like to be buried. I'm thinking, right, okay, well, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, there's still one space left at Phillips Park. And she said, no, she said, I'd like to be buried in Forest Lawns in the Hollywood Hills.
Ambition, I like that. But you could, you know, the thing with ashes is you can take some of her.
Sam, this is my inheritance. I nearly choked. I was like, I wouldn't have thought so, Mother. Cremated, I'll have to stick her in my handbag and try and get her across.
But the great thing about cremation is you can do both. She can be in both Phillips Park and in America at the same time. So, you know, that's the thing.
I'm trying to see if we've got any more. Have we got any more questions?
We've one here for you. When did local authorities in the area begin to provide cemeteries?
Well, I think I answered that. So in Manchester, it was 1866.
Oh, you did,
yeah. Salford was the decade before, but Manchester was 1866. We were somewhere behind other places in getting a municipal cemetery. Now, it's quite a funny one. So in the 1850s, Liverpool opened a Catholic cemetery called the Ford Cemetery. Manchester didn't have a Catholic burial ground. So it had St. Patrick's. Then that got closed because in the 1850s, when health reforms came in and burial acts, that got closed. So then when the municipal cemetery opened, the Catholics got a spot in the municipal cemetery, which was great because they literally had more or less their own cemetery. So you kind of go out of Phillips Park through some big gates, over a little brick path, and then into what feels like a separate cemetery. It kind of is. It's got its own gates. It would have had its own chapel, not there anymore. So the council built the Roman Catholics their own separate section, and it was really popular. Catholics were outnumbering both the Church of England and the Dissenters Nonconformist burials by some. But what happened is the Roman Catholics argued that the corporation had given them the worst spot in the cemetery because it was quite low lying down to the River Medlock. And a couple of times, one in 1869, there was a little flood. Then in 1872, there was a huge flood. And over 70 odd bodies washed from their graves down the Medlock, travelled 3 miles from the cemetery to Castlefield. You can imagine, can't you, just, you know, you're walking through Castlefield and you look at the Medlock and there's like coffins floating down the Medlock. And they did manage to get all the bodies back, but they didn't quite know who everybody was. So they actually put them at the local pub, and people could get a ticket and go to the local pub and hopefully identify their dead ancestor that had been buried for ages.
They're decomposed as
well. Yeah.
Oh gosh.
They did eventually reclaim everyone and reburied them. And then what happened was the Catholic community was so outraged because they felt that Manchester Corporation knew that this ground was prone to flooding. There was a big inquiry, and Dr. Holland came up from London, and you know, it was made all the papers. It was a real big deal. So the Roman Catholics after that never trusted Phillips Park Cemetery. So not long after that, they built their own in Moston, and the numbers of Roman Catholics dropped rather quickly in Phillips
I'm
Park.
laughing. I've been walking in that Moston one every day in lockdown.
Oh, have you?
Yeah, I live near it, and that's been my lockdown space, if you like. I know it's a bit unusual that a graveyard is my lockdown space, but I guess it's a so well, that's I've spent quite a lot of time there, so I was wondering how that was connected to that space.
There's some fabulous monuments in there, so I love looking at monuments. I don't know why. I love looking at, you know, how people are memorialized, and there's some absolutely fabulous ones.
I'm going to come in here a bit, ladies, because we've only got a few minutes left. It's been absolutely fascinating, but there's just a few little other things. A lot of people are asking for reading lists. So is there any things that you could, if people are really interested in this subject, and it looks like people are, is there anything that you can suggest to people that they can take away from this, that they can go and, you know, do their own reading?
I was going to mention that to you, Karen, because I saw it popping up a few times. From my perspective, if you're interested in the more contemporary stuff, then drop a line to Manchester Histories and I'll put something together and send it you out in an email.
Yeah, shall I do the same then, Karen? If I send a bit of a list over,
you can send it out to this group and whatever to help people.
Yeah.
You know. So I think that would be great. I mean,
but just sort of note to the people listening, my stuff tends to be more sort of, I'm not a historian, it's more sociological. So, but I'd be really happy to provide that because it's lots around death and dying.
Oh, I can see Ali's got some there called Forgotten Fields, but I can't see who it's by.
Yeah, so Forgotten Fields is a good one. That's if you're interested in Manchester's history, that is a good one. Manchester's burial history, that is a great one, by John Marsden, I think it is. So people were interested in that, and obviously there's lots of other questions and comments on here which have been great. People, Eve saying, in Ireland you do buy the plot. My uncle bought my aunt's plot for her birthday, so that was nice. And once she always joked saying it was the most romantic gesture that she's ever had.
So there's some amazing comments on here from everybody, and like I say, we've got 1 minute left now, so I just want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for coming today, but particularly to thank Michala and Sam for what is a most fascinating and interesting talk that we've had this lunchtime. We do hope that you have enjoyed it. I was just trying to see whether there's any more. There was one that I read about somebody's ashes going up in a firework.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard that.
Produced a beautiful display, I would imagine, and a burst of energy for that life.
Yeah.
And I love that idea. So thank you, whoever shared that. I can't remember. Sorry, there's been so many messages. But no, it's just so fascinating. And if we can just everyone can give a virtual clap to our lovely guests today. We're so happy that you've been able to join us. Thank you, everybody. And I hope you have a lovely day. And we will try and send out a reading list to people.
Yeah,
and
no
we've
problem.
got some more salons coming up. So again, if you want to join us on some more lunchtime salons, please do. One is around migration and communities, and one is actually around pet and pet loss, which Michala, you talked about the loss of your horse, and I think pets also play a big part in our lives and how we feel, obviously, when we lose pets as well. So we look forward to that salon as well. So please do join us again if you can. And we will send out a little feedback form as well. So again, if you've got any ideas out there that you'd like to see in these salons, please do let us know. Okay, everybody, I'm just going to do the lovely wave and the clap.
Thanks, Michala. Thanks as well.
Bye. Thanks, Sam. See you
I
on.
just want to say
Bye.
thanks to Nadine, wherever she is, for
Thank you.
organising
Thank
all
you.
this.
Brilliant.